And so Jane started that off. And so now I'll hand over to Rupert. And Rupert's talking tonight on the subject of food.
I'll get your slides up, Rupert.
Well, while you're getting them up, I shall say good evening, everybody. And I'm made some changes to this talk, which I did give to core members some time ago, but it's not exactly the same. And what I would like to say is I think there are three big things that people can do, because this is an action week, about climate. And one of those is look at their transport systems, how they get about. The second is how they're going to insulate their home and the energy use of their home. But the third big one is food. And so let's concentrate on food this evening. And next slide, please. First slide. A report came out from RAP last week. RAP is the waste and recycling sort of NGO, which has now gone global. And they've put out an appointment, presentation to the G7. And in it, I gleaned food production contributes around 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So food production is very important. Other people put it slightly lower than that, but that's a good figure anyway. Even if all other greenhouse gas emissions ceased, global food production on its own would push Earth beyond the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5%. So it's obvious we've got to do something about food. And in order to deliver net zero, we need fundamentally to rethink and redesign our food systems. Next, please. Now, food and climate. As I said, I think it's now the food system is now being given as 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but that doesn't matter. It's a lot anyway. But in the UK, the food sector's emissions represent just under 20% of everything we produce. But that rises to close to the global average if you factor in emissions from the imported food that we consume. And that was one of the points in the RAP report, that it is not terrestrial emissions that we should be talking about when it comes to climate. It is consumption emissions. What are we actually consuming in this country? And that is what should be compared between nations, and we've got to get down. Next, please. Now, this circular thing that I pinched from the National Food Strategy shows that in food, it is agriculture on the right-hand side that is making the biggest impact on food. We also have to consider transport, how far food travels, packaging, manufacturing, fertilizer, and other things. But it's the agriculture that is responsible for the greatest number of emissions. So next, please. And there are four major ways in which food systems contribute to climate change. The first one is converting wild areas to farmland, and we all think of the Brazilian rainforests there, the Amazon rainforest, but there's also things like Indonesian palm oil production and all sorts of other activities going on, converting wild areas to farmland. And when you plow up or remove forests and so on, you're not only just taking out the trees, you're disturbing the soil, and all that carbon that has been locked up in the soil is suddenly allowed open to all the bacteria that break it down and release carbon dioxide. So you get a huge release of carbon dioxide. And the same happens when you plow up peat. And if you dig peat, of course, it breaks down. As you know, by the end of the season, your peat is less than it was at the beginning of the season in the pots, and because it's breaking down. And the same happens on the wide agricultural lands in the east of England, which are were peat soil. Many of them have now lost their peat topping, and you're down to the clay or the sand underneath already. So that is releasing carbon from the soil. There are fossil fuels in every other part of the food system, as I've just said, being involved in transport and packaging and things like that. But the most important thing from our point of view in the UK is the release of methane and nitrous oxide from agriculture. Next, please. So food and carbon. The food system decarbonized at less than half the pace of the wider economy. This is in the UK. So in other words, everybody else has been getting on with it, but food has not been getting on with it. And that's partly because we've been getting on with it, but an awful lot of ours is overseas manufacture. Agriculture did not decarbonize at all. So that is the bit on the right-hand side, the pink bit on the right-hand side of the circle, has not changed. But since then, the NFU has set the ambitious goal of reaching net zero by 2040, and the biggest problem is methane. I think farmers are going to do it. I think they will. No, it's okay. Next one. And the big culprits are these lovely girls. Oh, in actual fact, I think some of them are boys. But anyway, they're chewing the cud happily and belching and farting away. So we've got to find a way of stopping that. But things are changing, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. Next, please. Methane globally is put out not only by ruminants like those, but also by rice paddies. So we are importing methane gas by eating a lot of rice grown in other countries. But we need to urgently cut our own methane emissions by 2030, and it's cows and sheep that hold the key. Next, please. Just quickly, the other sort of things that are emitting carbon dioxide, the operations such as ploughing and cultivating the soil, all cold stores the farmers have, processing food, carting it about, and packaging it is quite significant. Next, please. But on the other side, farming has a good role to play, possibly, in sequestration, in capturing carbon, because we've got to actually get some of the carbon dioxide out of the air that has been put there over the last 150 years or so. And some of the things suggested are listed here. We've all heard talk about trees, but remember that trees are only really fixing carbon and making an impression in the middle years of their lives. For the first 10 or 15 years, they're too small to make much difference. Then they start putting on timber and a nice trunk, and that is full of carbon. And then they reach peak growth, maybe after 50 or 100 years. Really, they're in balance then, and what they lose in dead branches and leaves and things is equal to what they're putting on. So they're not doing much more. And that is the time when you need to harvest the tree, which the biodiversity people probably won't like, but you've got to get that tree down and use the timber for something which is going to keep it for longer. Put it in a cathedral roof and it'll be there for 1,000 years. What we can do is also improve our hedges. If we look after them properly, make sure they're nice and thick, increase the width of them by a meter and the height by a meter, that will make a huge difference. And it's a very good place for planting some trees in the hedge every 50 or 100 yards down the roads and things. We want a nice selection of hardwood trees. Peat. There is a move now to take peat lands out of agricultural production, to re-wet them and to start them storing peat again, storing carbon dioxide again in the peat. Peat, as you know, is made up from sedges and grasses and mosses, which are buried underwater in anaerobic conditions, and therefore the fibers and things remain and don't get eaten by bacteria and so on. So, but it's a very, very, very slow process. So we can stop the emission of carbon dioxide from the peatlands, but actually capturing more is going to be quite slow, I think. Grass, what are we going to do in grass? The ancient grasslands are probably reached peak carbon, and new grass, you're going to plough it up again to plant something else. after a short time. So it's only a short-term solution. But if you can get grass and any plants to root deeper so that more organic matter from the plant's roots that are dying off and things is captured in the deep soil, that is a way of fixing carbon. And arable soils now, we're looking at regenerative farming, which I'll talk about a bit later, that could increase the amount of carbon in our soils. When we talk about carbon in the soils, we're talking about what we in the garden we call humus, basically. It's all the bits and pieces of organic matter rotting down very, very slowly. Just make sure that people know that plants get their carbon from the air, not from the soil. Carbon in the soil doesn't get taken into the plants, but it's there to be eaten up by all the bugs and beetles in the soil. Next, please. Just quickly on nitrogen, fertilizer manufacture is a very energy hungry thing. It's the Haber process, isn't it, of taking nitrogen from air and making either ammonium nitrate or ammonia to start with, or urea fertilizers. And as you can see in both those molecules, nitrogen features largely, and that nitrogen has come out of the air. And the problem with fertilizer, the fertilizer that is not used by plants, by your wheat crop, other things happen to it. Fertilizer wasted in the soil is broken down by bacteria to nitrous oxide, which is emitted to the air. And animals, manure also puts out nitrous oxide, and slurry, for those that don't know, is just the liquid form of manure without the straw added. Nitrogen also, nitrates and so on, get into the water courses and cause water pollution, which is causing algal blooms and lots of other problems, because water companies, as we heard yesterday on the talk, have to get the nitrates down. I raised the point yesterday about blue babies not being very common. Blue babies are the only things that have actually died from nitrate pollution in water, but the law says that we have got to get it down. And also air pollution with nitrogen or nitrous gases is causing problems with plant growth in certain places. Next, please. Food imports. Obviously, we don't want to cart food about any more than we need to, and carting it about by air is very questionable, and we're having to think very hard how we're going to get over that problem, because a lot of our vegetables and fruits are imported by air. But we must remember that Spanish tomatoes generate less carbon than UK tomatoes grown in a heated glasshouse, because Spain has lots of sunshine and it doesn't take that much carbon to transport the tomatoes up here, particularly if you send them by train, which some do. Next, please. Interesting to the food imports of beef. Carbon footprint of beef. Brazilian beef has a high carbon footprint simply because it is grown on land cleared from forestry. And the same presumably applies to the, what's the name of the Cerrado, isn't it? Or the land surrounding the rainforest. So, but US beef is lower in carbon than UK beef, generally speaking, because US beef is grain-fed, grown on maize and beans and so on, and growth is faster with the hormones that are fed to it. The quicker you can get an animal to being eaten, the less time it has had to put out methane. It's as simple as that. So the faster they grow, the less methane they put out. We have other reasons, though, for using grass. And perhaps we can talk about that a bit later if I get time. Next, please. This is interesting, two slides here. This one shows how many people there were in relation to wild animals 12,000 years ago. We weren't that important. We were a tiny part of it, and there were plenty of bison roaming the steppes and all the rest of it, and woolly mammoths and all those things. But now, next slide, please. the situation has changed completely. The orange and yellow on the left are livestock that we eat. The other animals we keep as pets are the blues on the top, horses, dogs and cats, and compared to people on the right-hand side. And you can see the volume of all these, the impact mankind has had on animals in the world compared to wild animals. It's huge. So it is our impact that's causing trouble. Next, please. Meat, regenerative farming involves bringing back livestock to arable farms, because in regenerative farming, you increase the number of crops grown in rotation, and one of those is usually grass. And if you're going to put in temporary grasslands, what they call a ley, L-E-Y, then something has got to eat that. You can either turn it into silage by mowing it, but it's better to put the livestock on it, because then their manure feeds the farm and you improve your soil enormously. So, but our appetite for meat is unsustainable, and 85% of UK farmland is used to feed livestock in one way or another. And in England, it's with grass. In America, as I said, a lot of it's grain-fed. We think grass-fed is better. Next, please. Next slide here. So the goal recommended in the National Food Strategy, which came out last year, is that we should all aim to reduce our meat consumption by at least 30% over the next 10 years. That's not too difficult to do. I don't think we need to come out of meat altogether. And if we do, there will be horrible consequences for our countryside. We won't have our wildflower meadows. We don't need these walls and hedges here and the little fields we got and the lovely cows I look at out of my window over there. So I hope that we don't have to all go vegan or vegetarian. Cutting our meat and dairy intake by 1/3 would give us back 1/5 of our farmland. So we have to decide which dairy or beef land that we give back to forestry or farming, but probably the least productive bits of our farms. Next, please. Yes, this shows the worldwide picture, not the UK picture. On the top of that slide, you can see that agricultural land is, I'm talking just about agricultural land, not about forestry and other stuff. 77% of that is taken up by livestock and 23% by crops. That's an amazing total. And then you can see the dotted line leads down to the next line, which shows the calorie supply, the global calorie supply. And 18% of calories come from that 77% livestock. 82% come from the 23%. So that just shows that livestock is a very inefficient way of producing calories, and it's also a little bit less, but also a very inefficient way of producing protein. Next, please. So feeding the world. We have loads of food in this world, quite enough to feed 7.8 billion people. And if we've just turned some of the meat back into plant crops that we can eat, then there will be no problem. But the problems are uneven distribution of agriculture, particularly with the Ukraine war going on. We've seen that in black and white so clearly. Damage to biodiversity from agriculture, beef or meat, too much of it, red meat, is not so good for our health, harm to climate, and very wasteful. Next, please. Now, feeding the UK in food security is an important consideration, and that has been discussed a lot recently too. The UK produces 60% of domestic food by value. But it's interesting that we've not been self-sufficient since the 1830s. What happened in the 1830s? It was the Corn Laws, I believe, from history, or something to do with that. And then grain was imported from North America, our colonies. and Canada, sorry, and the US. And we got up to where we got down to about 30% self-sufficiency at the Second World War, the beginning of the Second World War. During the 1980s, I believe we got up to 70%, but we're down to 60% now. I think we could go up a bit from 60%, but we're obviously always going to be importing quite a lot of our food. Highly processed foods is interesting, are 3 times cheaper per calorie. And this is a big problem because they're the ones that are causing the health problems, the obesity and the fat and sugar problems. And that's leading to 3 in 10 people in this country being obese. All these sort of things I've grabbed out of the Food Strategy Report, and they're very interesting reading. So I do recommend anybody who hasn't read it. I know it's a lot of pages, but it is terribly interesting and quite readable. Next, please. Obesity isn't a recent problem. This was 1804, and it's a lovely picture, isn't it? Look at them. Look at him. I can't believe it. And of course, he's a meat eater, isn't he? It's nearly all meat on his plate. Yeah, next one. Okay. Then and now. Now, this is where I'm going to miss a pointer, but so I'll just have to say left and right. The food system is all about lots of producers, lots of small farmers in this country and abroad on the left-hand side there. And they're all producing different crops, usually specializing just a few. And that all has to be grouped together, all processed and packaged through to a wholesale system in the middle right. And the wholesalers and the retailers buy from the wholesalers, and we go to the shops and buy from the retailers. And the retailers are also many. So you've got many producers on the left-hand side producing few things, and many consumers on the right-hand side consuming lots of different things. And somehow you have to have a sort of grouping process in the middle. And then it was wholesalers and retailers that were doing the process of grouping. Nowadays, it's more supermarkets. So supermarkets aren't on this picture, but for wholesaling and retailing, read supermarkets today. Next, please. Some slides to remind us of what went on. In the 1970s, I started fruit growing and took on my father's farm. We had about 70 acres. And we grew apples, blackcurrants, and sweet corn to start with. And there were many small growers around the country like us. We used manual labor for harvesting and handling. Most things were done by hand, apart from the tractor work, the spraying and the ploughing and things like that. Interesting what happened in packaging, because I haven't mentioned packaging elsewhere. In those days, I remember great stacks of these wooden 40-pound apple boxes on the farm. And most of them, we had some of our own, but most of them belonged to wholesalers. So we'd have a pile of Brooks and Springs boxes from Bolton and another one of Francis Nichols from Birmingham and so on. And when it came to picking the fruit or packing the fruit for them, we would put it into their boxes. Their lorry would come down, shall we say, once a week or once a fortnight, pick up a load, all loaded on by hand. Those boxes are quite heavy. They weigh 56 pounds, and we went 6 or 7 high on the lorry. And they would go up to the wholesale markets. The wholesalers, retailers would come to the wholesalers and buy these boxes and pay a deposit on the box. And they would make a nice display in their shop, but they would often serve you from the box under the counter. And the boxes then were taken back to the wholesale market and reclaimed their deposit. Sent them back to us on the next time they sent an empty lorry down to us to collect more fruit. So that was how the system worked. It's quite efficient, really, when you think of it. Next, please. I like this picture because it shows strawberry pickers. It also shows chip baskets, because when I mention chip baskets to people, they look at me blankly and don't know what a chip basket is. Well, it's made of poplar wood, and it has a little tin handle over the top, and it was used for putting fruit in. We packed all our sweet corn in boxes like this, and graded it according to the number we got in the box. The other interesting thing about this picture is the labour force. You've got the men for doing the hard work, but well, the work that required strength, but the ladies, a lot of housewives in the back, the picture there, and younger ladies working on the farms, and also a lot of children. And so that is quite an interesting comment on how life has changed. Next, please. So the local wholesale markets, that's not local to production, but local to consumption. But there was no cold chain in those days. So things had to go through fast, and there was a lot of wastage through stuff rotting on the way. So there was much more emphasis on seasonal produce, and even imports were pretty seasonal. And small retailers, like this one, up to the market at 6 o'clock in the morning and stock up and put it out on display by 9 o'clock in the morning. And when we bought fruit and veg in those days, it was always in paper bags. And it's interesting that America carried on using paper bags for fruit and veg much longer than we did. Next, please. Just to show you what's happened in the more recently, this is the Rungis wholesale market in Paris. It's one of the biggest, I think, in Europe, but it shows on the left-hand side, you can see the railway lines coming in to the market. And then in the center top, you can see those sheds there. They would be the areas where the trucks came in and supplied the wholesale stands, and where the buyers came in later in the day. You can also see that this is near the main Paris ring road, so it was very good for transport. A lot of good planning in this market. The right-hand picture shows the buying floor in the center of those sheds, where people walked up and down the middle or used barrows for carting things, but the lorries came in on the left and the right-hand side at the back of the wholesalers' stands. And that's how I always remember the wholesale markets. Covent Garden was very similar. Next, please. Supermarkets came in the first UK supermarket was 1951. I remember great excitement in about 1967 when McFisheries opened a supermarket in Harpenden, where I lived. So they came in the 70s, and the concept developed through the 60s, 70s and 80s. What happened was that the supermarkets could not get what they wanted from the wholesale markets. To start with, they were buying fruit and vegetables from the wholesale market. But the prices varied from day to day, which made it very difficult for them. The quantities, things were not available one day and were in surplus the next, and so on. They were just not reliable enough. So they started buying direct and having a program for the year that they agreed with their growers. Fruit and veg was sold loose and pre-packed. There's a whole story there that I could enlarge on, but I haven't got time today. Supermarkets like full shelves, lots of variety and year-round availability, and they want consistent and competitive pricing. Next, please. This just shows what has happened, who the big supermarkets are. I expect you all know this, but Tesco's is by far the biggest with 27% of the market. Then Sainsbury's and Asda's vie for second and third place. It shows Morrison's above Aldi, but this last week, Aldi overtook Morrison's, and Lidl is chasing up behind. So soon, instead of having the big four, it's going to be at least the big six, with Aldi and Lidl included. And then you've got the Co-op, which is a slightly different type of enterprise, and Waitrose has a different clientele, Iceland and Ocado. Doesn't mention Marks and Spencer's. I'm not quite sure why not, except that Ocado do handle, I think, Marks and Spencer's deliveries, but I would have thought Marks and Spencer's would be in there somewhere. Next, please. Quickly, to talk about strawberries. What am I doing for time? Getting on a bit. I'm wondering whether I should skip this bit. Yeah, I think so, Jane. Can you shuffle through strawberry season 3? Right. One of the things that's upset fruit growers is the huge reliance on overseas labour. And we in agri-foods employ 4 million, that's 13% of all employees in the UK. And of course, they're not all tractor drivers. They're doing all the manual jobs in all the processing sectors and in harvesting. And up to 2018, 99% of seasonal agricultural workers were from outside UK. And I remember that starting in the late 80s. We started picking fruit for supermarkets, and we had some African gentlemen were the first turned up on our farm, and I employed them. Didn't realize I shouldn't be just employing them like that. They were students in London. But anyway, we got onto the correct scheme, the seasonal agricultural worker scheme, and we employed sort of 30 or 40 Eastern Europeans and North Africans on the farm. They all camped in those days. We didn't have to supply accommodation for them. Since Brexit, the seasonal agricultural worker scheme has been restarted, but we went through terrible trouble at the beginning of Brexit. Next, please. We need 70,000 seasonal workers. Only 24,000 came in 21, and that was COVID and Brexit. And in 22, 30,000 visas were issued to start with, and then they issued another 10,000, but it doesn't make up for the 70,000 that's needed. So there have been large labour shortages, 40% leading to crops unpicked, and terrible troubles for non-fruit and vegetable growers, because they were not part of the SOAR scheme. So the daffodil growers and the other silly flower growers, don't mean silly stupid, I mean Scilly Island flower growers, had great trouble getting enough labour. Next, please. What's the solution to the labour? The government has said automation, but that's a long way away, 10 years away for harvesting. And it's harvesting we're talking about. And I think it's so sad in a way, because these youngsters who come picking largely come to experience travel, to earn quite a lot of pocket money to take home. And it's very good for international exchange. They meet a lot of people, and a lot of our students go and work overseas too in their gap year and so on. So why not? The only things that are automated for harvest really in England at the moment are black currants and peas and one or two other crops that you can pick by machine. Black currants are shaken off the bushes or go to Ribena pretty well, and peas go for freezing. Within 2 hours of being harvested, they're frozen. Fantastic organisation that is. UK workers, we found when our housewives went that other workers were just not interested to join the bulk of our labour force. And this last year, the wages have gone up exponentially to £10.10 an hour minimum wage. Of course, most fruit pickers are paid on piecework, but they have to earn a minimum of that, and the grower has to make their wages up to that if they don't earn it on piecework. And that's 7% above the national living wage. So that was a huge shock for growers this year. Next, please. Right. I think a lot of people don't know about qualities and standards, and it's something I've been involved in quite a bit. So I just wanted to say something about that. And this has come due mainly to the influence of the supermarkets. And my conclusion is going to be that you're far safer and doing better for the environment, actually buying your fruit and vegetables from a supermarket than you are from a greengrocer. I'll explain why. Next, please. There are standards enforced by the government. Those are the normal grading standards based on the size and the appearance of the fruit or vegetables. And they're the same as, well, we had them before we entered the common market, and then we adopted the European ones, and now we've still got the same ones as far as I know. But they are really of very little importance. Her Majesty's inspectors look at the wholesale markets occasionally go on a farm, and occasionally go to a retailer, but they mostly deal with complaints. But the main impetus comes from these supermarkets who put out specifications to growers of what they want. And that's not just size and shape and quality, but it's also all the compliance regimes that growers have to go to. Now, next slide, please, because I put these, Jane, I think you did these, or Harry did, very useful. The most important one of these standards for farmers and growers is global GAP. GAP, that's the top left-hand one. GAP stands for Good Agricultural Practice, and this applies to farmers, and it covers things like labor conditions, how you decide what fertilizers you should put on. In fact, you've got to have soil analysis done to justify what fertilizer you use. You have to have an advisor or know what pests you've got to decide what pesticides you use. There's a whole raft of stuff under Global GAP, and it's very good. And it started because the supermarkets were starting to audit farms in this country, and growers got fed up because each supermarket had a different set of standards. And not only they're all audited by Tesco's one week, and if they also supplied Sainsbury's, they'd have a whole load of different ones to satisfy the following week. So we started a system in England, and then I think it spread into something called Europe GAP. It was based in Germany, and the name of that was then changed to Global GAP. And it applies worldwide now for the fruit and vegetables and things moving around, and agricultural products moving around. And we know it very well because Lana translated the whole thing into Chinese. So just below Global GAP, you will see there is China GAP. And so China GAP is benchmarked against Global GAP. But in the days when I was in China, we were trying to apply Global GAP to Chinese apples being exported to Sainsbury's. And we managed to get them past Global GAP eventually, with a lot of hilarious incidents. In the UK, you don't come across Global GAP because it's called Little Red Tractor. And I think most people will know the Red Tractor scheme that you see on packets of this, that, and the other. And the Red Tractor scheme benchmarks our standards against those of Global GAP. So it's a very, very good scheme, but it is a basic scheme. For processors and other food handlers and pack houses that aren't on farm, then the standard is GFSI, which used to be BRC, British Retail Consortium, but that was joined the international ones and became the Global Food Safety Initiative. So that's quite similar to Global GAP, except it is for processing, storage, and people who handle fruit and vegetables and products generally, food. Two of the things that are important under Global GAP, these things are facts. Facts is the exams and tests that anybody advising on fertilizers have to pass and keep up to date with, and BASIS, which stands for British Agricultural Safety Inspection Scheme, something like that anyway. It's to do with pesticides. And I had to pass both, quite a tough exam. And you have to be up every year, you have to collect so many BASIS or facts points. So there's continuous professional development going on, and to make sure people are up to date. If a farmer doesn't employ an advisor to tell him what to use in the way of chemicals or fertilizer, then he has to pass these things himself and give himself his own advice. When it comes to managing the farms and the environment, LEAF is a very good organization. That's the one on the right. And that's been going for 25 years, started by ran by a single lady, really got it all going. And it's been a fantastic organization. And it's one up from Global GAP with much more emphasis on the environmental side. But it's not organic. It is good agricultural practice with paying particular attention to what you're doing in the field. And I think it's going to be very important with regenerative farming. some of you know my opinions of organic growing and so on, but there's the Soil Association and the Organization of Farmers and Growers, Organic Farmers and Growers, and various other organizations, and they set their own standards. Personally, I don't believe in their standards, but I believe in a lot of what they do, and they've been a force for good generally in getting growers to adopt new techniques and moving away from the chemical treadmill. But their standards are very rather a little bit questionable, but the great thing is if you pass them, you get more money for your produce in the supermarkets. As probably anybody who shops at Waitrose has come across Dutchy Organic, which is always much more expensive than anything else. Next, please. A little bit on waste. Waste is generated everywhere in the food system. If it happens on farm, it is not really so much waste. The point of this graph again is from left to right, value increases all the way along, and the impact of the waste is much more because you've wasted all the things you've wasted all the activities you've done to the produce on the way. And if a consumer tips some stuff on their plate into the recycle bin, yes, it's going to biogas production, but just look at the processes it's been through to get there. Whereas if that happens on the farm, many farmers actually grow crops for biogas production. So that is not necessarily a waste. And farmers also put things like the sugar pulp after the sugar's been taken out. It goes to animal feed, and a lot of animal farmers get brewers' grains from the brewing industry. So there are all sorts of ways of using up the waste at the farm end. Just like to say very quickly about what happens with broccoli, for example. Broccoli is supplied for most of the year from English farms and from Spain in the winter. And obviously it grows slower in the cold weather at either end of the season and much faster in the middle of the season. But so growers have a planned computerized program of when they should sow their broccoli to give it time to come to maturity at the right time and produce a continuous supply to the supermarkets. So obviously when in the middle of the season, when the weather's hot, it grows much quicker and you don't need to plant so much. Now, what happens though if you get a hot spell? The broccoli comes on faster and faster, and consumers go and eat salads instead. So the demand goes down. So you've got a waste, and you can't avoid that. If you're going to have broccoli on the supermarket shelves consistently, there's going to be a time when supply and demand don't match. And the same applies when you get a cold spell. The consumers are wanting broccoli and it's not growing fast enough. Right, next please. Just shows that the people who waste most are all of us at home. 70% of food waste is in the home, and we have to look at ways of reducing that. I'm not going to talk about that this evening, but we have often discussed the situation with bog-offs, buy one get one free, and offers like that, which I believe the current government is going to scrap stopping bog-offs. Sad. Anyway, next please. So what can we do? How are we going to affect this system in our own actions? Obviously, we're going to do our disposing and recycling properly, and we are not going to be taken in by the supermarkets to buy more than we need, shop with a shopping list, and so on. But what else can we do? Next, please. For farmers, agroforestry is often talked about, and agroecology. And this means, generally speaking, growing several crops together in a field. Makes automation very difficult. One or two people are trying it, but what I've seen, I haven't seen anybody doing it very seriously. But this is presumably in Africa or somewhere, you can see bananas, you can see beans, and you can see some trees. So there are 3 crops that actually yield for the grower, and the beans are putting nitrogen back in the soil for the bananas, and the whole thing works together. But it's very difficult to get machinery into a system like this. So it rather depends on how you're managing the crop. And next, please. We're in this country looking much more at what we call regenerative agriculture. And the 6 core principles I've just got here, we've got time for them. First one is understanding your context of your farm operation. And this means, where are you farming? What is the rainfall? What is your soil type? Where is the market? What are you good at? Things like this. What is your labor supply? The next thing is minimizing soil disturbance. You've heard of min-till or no ploughing, various systems. This depends on your soil type. If you've got very heavy land and want to get a tilth on it, then you're going to have to plough. It also relies very largely on keeping glyphosate or Roundup available, because you have to get a nice tilth to put seeds into on the surface of the soil, and if they've got to compete with a lot of weeds, they're not going to get away with it. So you've either got to plough the weeds in, and then you've got a nice tilth, or you burn them off with a weed killer. But there isn't an easy way in the middle. Maximize crop diversity. That is what's happening at the moment. People are, for regenerative farming, perhaps growing 6 crops in their rotation, not just wheat and oilseed rape, but in there you'll have perhaps 2 or 3 broadleaf crops. If you can grow potatoes or something else as well. Beans and peas are very important because they fix nitrogen. So you try and broaden the crops that you're growing. And one of the crops you want to grow to improve your soil structure is grass, because grass is very beneficial to soil. So a short-term lay of 1 or 2 years of grass is a good idea, but of course it involves livestock. So on the far right, you can see that you will have to bring livestock in. And there's a bit of a problem, and the right-hand side of our country, the east side of our country, is very dry and not so good for livestock. And the left-hand side is very wet and good for livestock, but not so good for growing crops. So we have to look at the country and the geography of things. Keeping the soil covered is important, because putting in a cover crop, particularly in the summer, once you've harvested your wheat or whatever, your soil will be very full of residual nitrogen, because the bacteria in the soil have been breaking down all the organic matter and releasing nitrogen very fast in the hot weather. And so the soil is full of nitrates, and you want to put a crop in there as soon as you've harvested to mop it up. And that could be sort of turnips for the winter, or some grass or something else anyway. And that will also double up as a soil cover. So keeping the soil covered stops soil being washed off into streams and rivers and polluting the water supply. And so keeping something growing all the year in the ground is a good thing. So this is basically what regenerative agriculture is all about. And it's causing a lot of thought among farmers. They're all very excited about it and just working out what to do on their own farm. Next, please. That's nearly the end. So to summarize, there's a lot going on in farming. We can all do our bit by consuming less meat and working out not wasting food. But generally, agriculture is going to do its bit too. I think farmers are working hard on this, and all the support you can give them, the better. I think that's about all. Thank you very much. I'll just show further reading here if anybody wants to make a note of those. The National Food Strategy, I've mentioned, is excellent reading. The Government Food Strategy is a load of blah, 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 but you ought to know about it. And the recent RAP report to the G7 nations is very interesting too, and is not just about farming, it's about concrete and steel and other things that we can do in the G7 nations, and about cutting down consumption emissions rather than as fast as we can. Right, I think that's it. And thank you very much. I'm sure I've run over like mad. Yes, I've gone on for nearly an hour. Too much. Still, any questions?
None have come up in the chat, but I think on yet. But on behalf of everybody, I think just really great to say thank you to Rupert for sharing your knowledge there. It was really interesting. Not just an overview, it's deeper than that on areas that perhaps people were unaware of. So thank you very much. And Lily says thank you as well.
I have a question. I wanted to ask, because you talked about organic crops and being a bit sceptical about some of the standards there. And one of the things that I understand is banned for organic farmers is GM crops. And I wondered what your thoughts are on that, because it feels as if GM crops might be something that we really need in future. And perhaps some of the resistance to them needs to be overcome.
Of course it does, yes. We're starting to allow genetically gene editing in crops, but we're not allowing genetic modification. But this just recently, I read today that we have produced genetic tomatoes. Now, what have they got in them? They've got a gene from something in them which would make them either sweeter or better shelf life or something, and that's being grown in America. So we've given the technology for this to the Americans, but we're not going to be allowing it in this country. I think it is emotional. Some people are religiously against interfering with God's creation. Some people talk about Frankenstein foods, which is a load of nonsense. When you think about it, all foods that we eat have come from the wild, and they've all been genetically modifying themselves over millions of years. Every time there's a mutation, there's a genetic modification, and that is how things evolve. And that's how conventional breeding works in a way, because you take a strawberry with one set of genetics and you crop it with another one, mix the two up, and you get what you want eventually by inbreeding and breeding and breeding it out. And you can get over that process so much quicker with genetic modification. But just like the pesticides have to be tested for so severely, I mean, I didn't go into the system for pesticide testing on this, but all pesticides go through very rigorous testing. And just the same way that anything genetically modified should be tested, and we need to work out what the test should be. The trouble with it, Jane, is that it's GM is a process. It's a scientific technique. It's what you do with it that matters. You could produce something horrendous that could poison everybody if you wanted to, but you can also do a lot of good with it. So you have to look at each GM and analyze it and see, is this safe? Test it on a small area, and look at the amount of GM stuff we're all consuming at the moment with American produce, and all the cotton and things is GM. What harm is it doing?
Okay.
Very little.
I think Richard or Patsy, you've got your hand up, Patsy.
Yeah, that was really interesting, Rupert. Thank you.
Thank you, Patsy.
Unless I have missed it, I was slightly distracted by the cat at one point, but you said that it is...
Oh, hang on a second. I've just got to stop my daughter shrieking. Dom! Dom! Shut up, I'm online. Probably got her headphones on, so you have to shout really loudly at her. Because they're special noise blocking headphones, so we can never get hold of her. Anyway, sorry, start again, Pat. I couldn't hear that.
You may have told us this, and I might have missed it because I was distracted by my feline friend, but you said you would tell us why it is better for the environment if we buy our fruit and veg from supermarkets. And my issue with supermarkets is, for example, I wanted to buy some carrots last week, and normally I buy them from a local greengrocers, but I wasn't going in that direction. And I walked to 3 supermarkets, or Richard did on my behalf, and we couldn't find any carrots that weren't packed in plastic bags. So I was going to either have to do without carrots or buy more than I wanted. So I think that's quite often the case. A lot of supermarkets aren't packing in plastic anymore, but unless they're loose, you're rather limited. So I wondered about your thoughts on why it's...
Well, can I just talk about loose versus packaged? Because we had a farm shop, and we sold the apples loose in bins. And of course, people always take the best ones off the top. Gradually, within half an hour or so of lots of customers, the supply looked pretty grotty. So we had to go, because even with the best grading in the world, you know, there are some apples look better than others. So we were continuously going over the heap, taking off the rough ones, putting them in a paper bag. In our case, we used little paper bags, and selling them at half price at the bottom of the thing. So that is the problem for the supermarkets, is the display gets very grotty if you allow people to pick over and pick and choose. So put them in a bag, it's much easier. They come as a group. But I agree with you, for a single, when you're shopping alone for 1 or 2, it's too many, isn't it, in the bag? Finding small quantities. Paper bags obviously are better. I notice Waitrose bags now that we get on the online shopping, they're all compostable. So we feel less guilty about using them. Just put them in the food bin and they go away. We hope in the right place. But supermarkets have much stricter environmental rules. I mean, when you buy from a greengrocer, you've no idea, you don't even know which wholesale market he's gone to get the things. Around here, he'd have gone up to Leicester probably. And then who's controlling the people on the Leicester, amongst the Leicester wholesalers, and do they go around and inspect the farms? Supermarkets inspect the farms, inspect the pack houses, and Global Gap asked a lot of environmental questions that you can lie about, but you know, it's pretty comprehensive.
My favourite greengrocers is one in Market Harbour, and at this time of year you can buy Northamptonshire plums and Cambridgeshire apples, Northamptonshire, Leicestershire apples, and it's nice because they're not the, you know, they're not all the Gala and Pink Lady and Cox's and Granny Smith. I mean, much as I like Cox's, it's quite nice to have something different. So I tend to prefer a greengrocer, I'm afraid, to a supermarket.
Well,
but it's more expensive. So.
We do a bit of both. We do a bulk order with Waitrose every week, you know, pretty systematically. And I like jazz apples, so I have one of those every day until the Cox season comes. Then I stick to Cox till February and then move back to jazz again. And I'm quite happy with that for my lunch. But if you want something more exotic, I agree. And local produce. Lovely plums around at the moment, and of course Cambridge is a great area for plums. But how do they get there?
I don't think they're dropped off by fairies travelling around in little gold coaches.
So, well, I went to visit the wholesaler in the east side of Northampton, and he has a grower up in Cambridgeshire who sort of collects from other growers around there. And delivers to him, and then he delivers to the local schools and so on, and various shops. But it's quite a time-consuming business. The supermarkets are so efficient with these centralized depots. I was on a runner bean farm once, and they were supplying Marks and Spencer's, and all the time the beans were being picked, they were being weighed, it was being clocked into a phone thing of some sort, and that information was being relayed from the barcode straight into Marks and Spencer's, so they knew what was coming the next day and what they'd have to sell, and they could work out their shelf space and things accordingly. Incredibly efficient. And with cold chain, you see in the wholesale sector, there's no cold chain. It could be for longer term, but the stuff comes in on a truck, is put out on the stand, and greengrocers pick it up and sell it. But none of it's chilled. So this chilling at 8 degrees or so has made a huge difference.
I think
shelf life.
this discussion speaks to, we've had a question or a comment from David, which has come in, which is kind of this related, and it says, my question is the comparison of the 1970s to recent times. The theme seems to be more sustainable, with wholesale boxing bagged in brown paper and being more seasonal, which then goes on to say later shifted to supermarkets being better than greengrocers. So that sort of speaks to what we've been speaking of. I don't know if you want to come in and elaborate on that, David, or a sort of a comment.
No problem. Yeah, it was more so that I'm more based on like environmental kind of composting at the minute. Is my interest is community composting schemes, and I just think a lot of it is waste. I think it's local. Local is the way forward. But then that kind of contradiction came. So I just wanted to understand where Rupert's thought process was. Why the supermarkets were better. Is it more in terms of the transport, the automation, and that viewpoint, or is there an alternative perspective, Rupert?
The bag is one issue, isn't it? And it's the container the bags or the fruit is or whatever it is transported in. Because supermarkets all use returnable containers, so they're circular, and pallets are circular nowadays, aren't they? We didn't use pallets, of course, in the 70s, but the blue pallet scheme is pallets going round and round. It's debatable, isn't it? But I think the worst is the wholesale market system, because the grower has to pack it into a box that he's not going to see again, and it's going to be a cardboard box or a plastic, no, probably a cardboard box, but it's only going to go into recycling. It's not going to be reused. So I think reusing a box is probably better than recycling, if there's a natural system for getting it back.
Yeah. So the things that I've been working with a lot of packaging organisations such as Vegware, to try and work with them to understand that not everybody understands the difference between biodegradable, compostable, and elements like that as well. So it's trying to educate as well as understand, and that's why I join as many kind of different forums as possible for me to try and get a wider perspective of.
And it's very difficult, isn't it, David? My wife works still in the fruit trade, importing from Africa chopped fruit, which has to go in plastic because it leaks. So chopped up mangoes, you can't put them in anything else at the moment. Perhaps we shouldn't be buying chopped out mangoes that are flown in. That's another question. But the punnet, the plastics, you can't use recycled plastic in direct contact with the fruit. You can have a multi-layer punnet, I think, where the outside is recycled plastic and the inside is fresh plastic. But it's really complicated what you can use and what you can't use with recycling.
So yeah, my wife works in packaging, so I know that food grading is quite difficult, and so yeah, I understand that kind of perspective. But it was just interesting for me to see where your opinion had come from the 1970s to now. So it's more based on that, isn't it? It's the cold, the kind of cold systems to transport, but the wholesale is the worst one in terms of having to package it on, because they need to package it on.
Yeah,
that's where your thought process comes from. Yeah, no, thank you.
Interesting. We must talk about this offline sometime.
yeah, without a doubt. Thank you.
And I think this speaks of kind of trust, doesn't it? I think we're sort of thinking about trusted local suppliers and food miles. Sort of if you've got a farm which is local to you, you develop that relationship, or if you've got suppliers very local to you, perhaps that's a different cup of tea than, as you say, Rupert, from a sort of somebody who's buying in a wholesale market, which is different again. It raises a lot of questions, doesn't it? And we don't really consider necessarily in our normal.
One of the big questions is when you come to abattoirs, isn't it? I mean, we often pop over to Norton, to Elliott's butchers there, and I think he grows his own animals. But is there a local abattoir? The small local abattoirs are all closing because of the regulations on animal welfare, and they can't afford this very high-tech surveillance cameras and things on all their staff. And so then you have to transport the animals, which is not so good for the animals, much, much further to a very large abattoir. And he has to go further to get the meat back again. So I don't know how it works, but it's there aren't easy answers, are there, to some of these things?
And what are your thoughts, Rupert, about the NFU goal, the sort of 2040 goal? Do you feel that that's something that's been embraced by the industry, and that farmers are kind of grabbing with both hands and going, yes, we can do this? Or is it sort of, as with other environmental issues where, there are a select few who go, yeah, this sounds fantastic and we can do this, and the rest of them are like, no, that sounds like really hard work and too expensive?
Well, I think farmers will be producing their own fuel, won't they, from biomass in some ways, or could do. So that becomes a sort of circular economy. The big problem is this methane. You can cut methane now, I think, by feeding animals with seaweed or various things that cut the amount of gas they produce. Getting the Americans' tactics of getting them to grow quicker, you cut the methane. The great thing about methane is that it breaks down in the atmosphere. So if you look at it over 20 years, it looks terrible, but over 100 years, it's not so bad, because carbon dioxide is up there pretty well forever. Methane is not. So it's a balancing act of only putting up what can break down in the time. So we're going to be allowed a certain amount of methane in the air. And that is the big question. Nitrous oxide, I think they're going to get fertilizer more under control. You could, even with GM or something, put mycorrhizae into wheat plants probably, so that they catch their own nitrogen from the air without you having to put fertilizer on. And there are a lot of things there, aren't there? And also with laser technology and cameras and things, you could grow 3 crops in the field together. It might be possible to grow your beans climbing up your maize and be able to harvest them separately by technology, which would be very interesting. So things are going to change very quickly. And I think farmers are all farmers I meet are quite excited about it. So
well, that's good to know.
I went to the Regen meeting, as you know, and there was a lot of talk going on there.
We got any more questions from the floor? Anybody? Any comments or questions? Pop them in chat if you didn't want to speak. Oh, I think that might be it in that case.
I've gone on a long time, so I
You've covered a lot, Rupert, and it's very much appreciated sharing that insight and that information. Very interesting, as Jane says. So big thank you for your efforts.
Thank you, Jane, for operating my slides.
You're welcome.
It wasn't so bad as I thought it was.
Worked all right, didn't it?
So I've got a reminder that it's Harry talking about housing tomorrow. Oh, there's one more message. Hold on. Oh, now it's down to 2. Oh, somebody's saying thank you. I think that's Claire saying thank you, and David as well. So, Jane, is there anything we need to finish off with other than reminders of the other events are available on Eventbrite and on the website?
I think that's everything. Thank you. I'll stop the recording now.